There is a story that has not been told, a truth that has remained hidden for almost 2,000 years, buried under layers of silence, reinterpretations, and carefully constructed narratives. It is the story of a woman who walked alongside the greatest spiritual leader in history, who witnessed crucial moments of the Christian faith, but whose ending remained shrouded in mystery and forgetfulness. Have you ever wondered why we know so little about the final destiny of Mary Magdalene? Why does a figure so central to the Gospels, the first witness of the resurrection, simply disappear from the official narratives? What happened to her after the events described in the New Testament? And more importantly, why was her death, her final legacy, treated with so much silence by ecclesiastical authorities throughout the centuries? These are not new questions. Millions of people around the world across generations have felt that something was incomplete in the official story, a gap that was never adequately filled. And perhaps you, at this very moment, also feel this same restlessness within yourself. The story we are going to explore today is not just about the distant past. It is about how narratives are constructed, how voices are silenced, and how uncomfortable truths can be carefully removed from collective memory. It is about understanding that the official history we know is frequently just one version among many possible ones, a version that served specific interests at specific moments. Mary Magdalene is mentioned in the canonical Gospels more times than most male apostles. She is present at the crucifixion when many fled. She is the first to see the risen Christ. She is sent to announce the good news to the other disciples. However, in the following centuries, her image was distorted, her importance minimized, and her final destiny obscured by a veil of uncertainty. What we are about to explore is not fantasy or empty speculation. It is a careful investigation based on preserved ancient traditions, on manuscripts that survive time, on accounts transmitted from generation to generation, and on serious academic analyses about the first centuries of Christianity. Every claim we make will be grounded in verifiable historical sources or clearly identified as tradition preserved by popular memory. You will notice as we progress that we are not here to destroy faith or attack institutions. We are here to recover a story that deserves to be told, to give voice to a narrative that was silenced, to understand why certain truths were considered too dangerous to be officially preserved. Perhaps you have already felt when reading the Gospels that there was something unspoken about Mary Magdalene. Perhaps you have already wondered why such an important figure simply disappears after the Ascension. Perhaps you have already intuited that there was more to the story than we were told. And what if I told you that this intuition was correct? That there are traditions, manuscripts, and accounts that fill these gaps in profound and transformative ways. The journey we will take today will lead us from first-century Jerusalem to the shores of Provence in France. We will pass through sacred grottos, controversial relics, hidden manuscripts, and oral traditions that have withstood the test of time. We will discover why the final destiny of Mary Magdalene was treated with so much care, and in many cases, with so much secrecy by ecclesiastical authorities. But before we begin, it is important to establish something fundamental. This is not a quest for sensationalism. We are not here to invent conspiracy theories or create empty controversies. We are here as investigators of historical truth, respecting both the faith of those who believe and the academic rigor of those who study. Our commitment is to verifiable facts, to documented traditions, and to an honest analysis of what can be known and what remains in the realm of mystery. You are about to discover that the death of Mary Magdalene was not just a biographical event. It was a historical moment whose implications reverberated through the centuries, influencing how Christianity developed, how the role of women was defined in the early church, and how certain truths were preserved not in official texts, but in the margins of history, in local traditions, and in the memory of those who refuse to forget. Prepare yourself for a journey that will challenge what you thought you knew, that will fill gaps you didn't even know existed, and that will reveal why the final destiny of one of the most important figures of early Christianity remained hidden for so long. This is the story of the tragic end of Mary Magdalene, a story of exile, of unshakable faith, of institutional silencing, and of a truth that, despite all efforts, was never completely erased. To understand the mystery surrounding the death of Mary Magdalene, we first need to comprehend how her own identity was systematically distorted throughout the centuries. The silence about her final destiny is not an isolated accident, but part of a larger pattern of erasure and reinterpretation. In the canonical Gospels, Mary Magdalene appears as a figure of profound importance. Luke 8:1-3 tells us that she was one of the women who accompanied Jesus and the 12, supporting them with their own resources. This detail, frequently overlooked, reveals that she was not just a follower, but someone with her own resources and sufficient autonomy to financially support the entire ministry. Even more significant is her role in the final events of Jesus' life. While most of the male disciples fled during the crucifixion, Mary Magdalene remained. She was at the foot of the cross, witnessed the death, accompanied the burial, and was the first to discover the empty tomb. In John 20:1-18, it is Mary Magdalene who has the first encounter with the risen Christ and receives the instruction to announce the news to the other disciples. This fundamental role should have guaranteed Mary Magdalene a place of honor in early Christian history. However, something very different happened. In 591 AD, Pope Gregory the Great delivered a sermon that would forever change the perception of Mary Magdalene. He declared that Mary Magdalene, Mary of Bethany, sister of Lazarus, and the anonymous sinner of Luke 7 were the same person. This fusion of identities, which has no basis in the Gospel texts, transformed Mary Magdalene from prominent disciple to repentant sinner. For centuries, she was primarily known as the prostitute that Jesus saved, a narrative that, although powerful in terms of redemption, completely obscured her true historical role. Modern academic research demonstrates that this fusion of identities was problematic from the beginning. The Gospels clearly distinguish different Marys, and nowhere is Mary Magdalene identified as a sexual sinner. The Eastern tradition of the Church, incidentally, never accepted this confusion of identities, maintaining Mary Magdalene as a distinct and honored figure. But why did this distortion occur? Studies on the structure of the early Church suggest that there were significant tensions about the role of women in Christian leadership. Some ancient texts, including Gnostic documents discovered at Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 1945, preserve traditions that show Mary Magdalene in a position of spiritual leadership, sometimes even generating conflicts with other disciples. The Gospel of Mary, an apocryphal text probably dating from the 2nd century, presents Mary Magdalene teaching the other disciples about teachings that Jesus transmitted to her in private. When Peter questions her authority, Levi, probably Matthew, defends her, saying that Jesus loved her more than the other disciples. This text, although non-canonical, preserves memories of real tensions in the early Christian community. As the Church institutionalized in the first centuries, a predominantly masculine hierarchical structure was consolidated. In this context, female leadership figures could be seen as problematic or inconvenient. Some historical analyses suggest that the minimization of Mary Magdalene's role and the distortion of her identity may have served specific interests of power consolidation. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD and other subsequent councils defined which texts would be considered canonical and which would be excluded. This process, although necessary for doctrinal unity, also meant that many traditions about the early days of Christianity were officially discarded. Among those discarded traditions were many that preserved memories about Mary Magdalene and other women leaders. This is the essential context for understanding the silence about Mary Magdalene's death. If her life and her role were already considered problematic or inconvenient for certain official narratives, her final destiny would be even less likely to be preserved in the official records of the Church. Oral and local traditions, however, preserved stories that official texts did not tell. In the region of Provence in France, there are traditions dating back centuries about Mary Magdalene's arrival in that land. These traditions were preserved not in official church manuscripts, but in popular memory, in local cults, and in devotional practices that resisted time. The official silence about Mary Magdalene's destiny contrasts strongly with what we know about other apostles. We have clear traditions about the deaths of Peter, Paul, James, and others. But about Mary Magdalene, only silence in official texts and fragmented traditions in the margins of history. This silence is not neutral. It is a silence loaded with meaning, a silence that tells us as much as written words could tell. It is a silence that invites us to investigate more deeply, to question what was preserved and what was deliberately left out. If you have come this far, it is because you feel that these questions matter. Because you understand that recovering silent stories is not just an academic exercise, but an act of historical justice. If this investigation resonates with you, subscribe to the channel now. Not because we promise easy answers or cheap sensationalism, but because together we are committed to an honest search for historical truth, for complete narratives, and for understanding how we arrived at the official versions we know today. This is a journey of discovery, and you are an essential part of it. Before we explore her final destiny, we need to understand who Mary Magdalene really was. Removing the layers of distortion that have accumulated over the centuries is essential to comprehend why her death was treated with so much mystery. The name Magdalene indicates her origin, Magdala, a prosperous port city on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. Modern archaeological research has revealed that Magdala was a significant economic center in the 1st century, known for its fishing industry and commerce. This contextualizes the biblical information that Mary had her own resources to support Jesus' ministry. Luke 8:2 tells us that Jesus cast out 7 demons from Mary Magdalene. In modern understanding, Bible scholars suggest that this could refer to severe physical or mental illnesses from which she was healed. The number 7, symbolic in Jewish tradition, may indicate a complete and total healing. What is certain is that after this event, she became one of Jesus' most dedicated followers. All 4 canonical Gospels agree on crucial points about Mary Magdalene. She was present at the crucifixion, Matthew 27:56, Mark 15:40, John 19:25. She witnessed the burial, Matthew 27:61, Mark 15:47. She went to the tomb on the morning of the resurrection, Matthew 28:1, Mark 16:1, Luke 24:10, John 21. And most significantly, she was the first witness of the resurrection. This last point is extraordinary when we consider the cultural context. In 1st century Judea, women's testimony was not considered valid in court. However, the Gospels consistently preserve Mary Magdalene as the first witness of the most important event of the Christian faith. This narrative choice is remarkable and suggests that the evangelists were preserving a historical tradition so strong that it could not be altered, even if it was culturally inconvenient. John 20:11-18 preserves the most detailed encounter between Mary Magdalene and the risen Christ. She calls him Rabboni, my master, a term of profound respect and intimacy. Jesus sends her with the message, "Go to my brothers and tell them." This act of sending Mary with a message to the other disciples has profound theological significance. In early Christian tradition, an apostle was someone sent with a message. In this technical sense, Mary Magdalene was literally an apostle, sent by the risen Christ himself. The Eastern tradition of the Church has always recognized this, calling her is apostolos, equal to the apostles. Hippolytus of Rome, in the 3rd century, called her apostle to the apostles. This title was not metaphorical, but a recognition of her fundamental role in the founding events of the Christian faith. Some ancient manuscripts preserve additional traditions about Mary Magdalene. The Gospel of Mary, discovered in the late 19th century and probably dated to the 2nd century, presents Mary consoling the disciples after the ascension and sharing teachings that Jesus transmitted to her. When Peter expresses doubt that Jesus would have shared special teachings with a woman, Levi responds, "If the Savior considered her worthy, who are you to reject her?" This text, although non-canonical, preserves memories of real tensions in the early Christian community about female leadership. The Gospel of Philip, another Gnostic text, contains a controversial passage that refers to Mary Magdalene as Jesus' companion, a Greek term, koinonos, that can mean partner, companion, or associate in ministry. The manuscript is damaged precisely at the crucial point, leading to varied interpretations. It is important to be clear. There is no canonical biblical evidence that Jesus and Mary Magdalene had a marital relationship. This theory, popularized by modern fiction, has no basis in the most reliable historical texts. However, it is equally clear that Mary Magdalene occupied a position of extraordinary proximity and trust. What we can affirm with historical certainty is the following. Mary Magdalene was a woman of her own resources, deeply dedicated to Jesus, present at the most crucial moments of his ministry, and recognized as the first witness of the resurrection. She was sufficiently important to be mentioned by name in all 4 canonical Gospels, a distinction shared by few. The cultural context makes her prominence even more remarkable. In first-century Judaism, women had limited religious roles. They could not serve as legal witnesses, could not study the Torah with rabbis, and were generally excluded from religious leadership. However, Jesus clearly broke these cultural barriers, including women among his close followers, and entrusting them with roles of spiritual importance. Mary Magdalene represents, in many aspects, the most prominent of these women. Other women mentioned in the Gospels include Joanna, wife of Chusa, Herod's steward, Susanna, Mary, mother of James and Joseph, Salome, and others. But Mary Magdalene is consistently mentioned first in all lists, suggesting her position of leadership among the women disciples. This historical prominence makes the subsequent silence about her destiny even more intriguing. If she was so important in the founding events of Christianity, why was her final destiny not carefully preserved in the official texts of the Church? Why do we have clear traditions about the martyrdoms of Peter and Paul, but only fragments and local traditions about Mary Magdalene? The answer, as we will see, is intimately linked to tensions about female leadership in the early Church, to decisions about which traditions to officially preserve, and to institutional discomfort with narratives that did not fit perfectly into the developing hierarchical structure. Mary Magdalene was not just one follower among many. She was a leader, a fundamental witness, a figure of spiritual authority in the early days of the Christian movement. And it was precisely this importance that made her final destiny a delicate subject, and, for some, inconvenient to be officially preserved. Knowing who she really was helps us understand why what happened to her was treated with so much care, and ultimately with so much silence, in the official records of the Church. There is an ancient tradition, preserved for centuries in the region of Provence in southern France, that tells an extraordinary story about Mary Magdalene's destiny after the events of the New Testament. This tradition, although not recorded in canonical texts, was transmitted from generation to generation and kept alive through local cults, pilgrimages, and devotional practices. According to this preserved tradition, after Jesus' ascension and the beginning of persecution of Christ's followers in Jerusalem, a group of disciples was forced to flee. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary Salome, mother of the apostles James and John, Mary Jacobea, identified variously in different traditions, and other members of the early Christian community. The tradition relates that this group was placed in a boat without oars or sails, essentially left to die at sea, but that miraculously they reached the coast of Provence, landing in the area now known as Sainte-Marie de la Mer. This location, still today, is an important pilgrimage center, particularly for the Roma community, who venerate Sara la Kali, identified in local tradition as the servant who accompanied the Marys. It is important to note that this tradition is not a late medieval invention. References to it appear in texts from the 5th century, and the existence of local cults dedicated to Mary Magdalene in Provence can be traced even earlier. The tradition is sufficiently ancient and widespread to merit serious consideration as preservation of real historical memories. After landing, the tradition tells that the group dispersed to evangelize different areas. Mary Magdalene would have headed to the interior of Provence, eventually settling in a remote area of mountains and forests. Her final destiny, according to these traditions, was a grotto in the mountains known today as La Sainte-Baume. The credibility of this tradition is strengthened by several factors. First, the region of Provence had established commercial connections with the Eastern Mediterranean in the 1st century. It would be geographically plausible that refugees from persecutions in Judea would reach these shores. Second, the pattern of missionary dispersion described in the tradition is consistent with what we know about the expansion of early Christianity. Third, and perhaps most significant, the persistence and specificity of local traditions suggest some factual basis. Local cults are not usually invented from nothing, especially when they involve specific geographical locations and devotional practices transmitted across generations. Generally, they preserve memories of real events or people, even if details may have been embellished over time. The tradition of Mary Magdalene in France was sufficiently established that in 1279, when Prince Charles of Salerno, future King Charles II of Naples, ordered excavations in the crypt of the church at Saint-Maximin-le-Saint-Baume, he claimed to have discovered relics identified as belonging to Mary Magdalene. This discovery further stimulated the local cult and established Saint-Maximin as an important pilgrimage center. Modern historical analyses of these relics are cautious. There is no way to definitively verify their authenticity, and relic discoveries in the Middle Ages were frequently motivated by political and economic interests. Pilgrimages brought prestige and income to local regions. However, the existence of the cult prior to the 1279 discovery suggests that the tradition of Mary Magdalene's presence in the region was much older. What is most fascinating from a historical point of view is not necessarily whether the relics are authentic, but why this specific tradition emerged and persisted. Why Provence and not another region? Why Mary Magdalene specifically? Why the narrative of exile and not martyrdom like other apostles? Some scholars suggest that the tradition may preserve a real historical memory that some members of the early Christian community of Jerusalem, possibly including women leaders, really did flee westward after the intensification of persecutions. The destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD certainly caused a great dispersion of Jewish Christians, and it is plausible that some reached the Western Mediterranean. The choice of Mary Magdalene as the central figure of this tradition is significant. If the local community simply wanted to invent an apostolic connection to gain prestige, why not choose Peter or Paul, figures much more central in the official tradition of the Church? The choice of Mary Magdalene suggests an independent tradition, possibly preserving real memories. The narrative of exile and spiritual isolation, instead of glorious martyrdom, is also unusual and perhaps more credible precisely because of its lack of triumphalist characteristics. Mary Magdalene is not presented as a martyr conquering death, but as an exile living in contemplative isolation. This more sober narrative may reflect a more reliable historical tradition. What these traditions tell us, at minimum, is that there was a preserved memory that Mary Magdalene lived her last years away from Jerusalem, in exile, maintaining her faith in difficult circumstances. This narrative of spiritual perseverance in isolation has its own power, and perhaps better reflects the reality of the early Christians, not always glorious martyrdoms, but frequently lives of silent witness in adverse circumstances. Now, a question for you. What touches more deeply in your own spiritual journey? The idea of dramatic martyrdom, or the idea of persistent faith in isolation and exile? Write in the comments your reflection on what it means to remain faithful when there is no audience, when there is no recognition, when there is only you and your inner conviction. Your answer can help us understand why certain stories were officially preserved and others were kept only in the margins of tradition. The Grotto of Saint-Baume, located in the Rocky Mountains of Provence, approximately 150 meters high on a steep cliff, is one of the most extraordinary locations associated with the tradition of Mary Magdalene. According to locally preserved traditions, it was in this grotto that Mary Magdalene spent the last 30 years of her life in contemplation and prayer. The grotto itself is impressive. About 40 meters deep and 25 meters high, it opens on the face of a cliff covered with dense vegetation. Access is made by a steep and rocky path, emphasizing the isolation of the place. Inside the grotto, the temperature remains constantly cool, and there is a natural water source, an important detail for someone living in prolonged isolation. Historical records of pilgrimages to this grotto date back at least to the 5th century. St. John Cassian, a monk and theologian who lived between 360 and 435 AD, mentions the veneration of Mary Magdalene in the region of Provence in his writings. This establishes that the tradition of her presence in the area is very ancient, predating the Middle Ages. In the 13th century, the Dominican order assumed custody of the grotto and built a nearby hospice for pilgrims. The path to the grotto was improved, and a system of chapels and prayer stations was established. However, the grotto itself was maintained in its natural state, preserving the character of a wild and isolated place that would have characterized Mary Magdalene's experience. The preserved tradition describes that Mary Magdalene lived in the grotto in extreme simplicity, dedicating herself entirely to contemplation of the divine mysteries she had witnessed. According to some versions of the tradition, she would have been sustained by angels who elevated her to the heavens 7 times a day to hear celestial songs. This description obviously contains mystical and symbolic elements, but may preserve a memory of profound contemplative spiritual experiences. The number 7 appears again, the same number of demons cast out of Mary Magdalene at the beginning of her journey with Jesus. In biblical numerology, 7 represents completeness and perfection. The repetition of this number may suggest that the tradition saw Mary Magdalene's years in the grotto as a completion of her spiritual journey, begun with her healing. The choice of a grotto as a place of spiritual retreat has profound symbolic and practical significance in religious tradition. Grottos appear repeatedly in biblical and spiritual narratives. Elijah in the grotto of Mount Horeb, where he encountered God not in the wind, fire, or earthquake, but in the gentle whisper. The Essene communities who lived in the grottos near Qumran. The early Christian hermits who sought grottos in the Egyptian desert. The grotto represents a womb of the earth, a place of death to the world and birth to a deeper spiritual reality. It is a place of transformation, where silence and darkness allow an intimacy with the divine impossible amid the noise and light of the common world. For Mary Magdalene, who had experienced the most radical transformation possible, witnessing the death and resurrection of her master, a grotto would be an appropriate place to integrate and contemplate these mysteries. The tradition also preserves that Mary Magdalene did not live completely alone. According to some accounts, she occasionally received visitors, sharing teachings and memories of Jesus. Some medieval texts claim that a local hermit named Maximin, later considered a saint, served as her confessor and spiritual companion, although maintaining residence in a separate cave. The historical veracity of these specific details is impossible to verify. However, the persistence of the tradition and the specificity of geographical locations suggest that, at minimum, there was a preserved memory that Mary Magdalene or some significant female figure of early Christianity really did spend time in this region in spiritual retreat. The grotto became a powerful symbol in Christian spirituality. It represents the inner path, the journey beyond the external forms of religion to a direct experience of the divine. For Mary Magdalene, who had experienced the risen Christ directly, without mediation, life in the grotto may have been a natural extension of this spiritual intimacy. Pilgrims throughout the centuries have visited the grotto seeking their own experiences of spiritual transformation. The place maintains a quality of silence and presence, difficult to describe, but palpable to those who visit it. Regardless of precise historical verification, the grotto functions as sacred space, where people connect with profound dimensions of their own spiritual journey. The tradition of the grotto also preserves an important memory, that not all early disciples died in dramatic martyrdoms. Some lived long lives of silent witness, of profound contemplation, of integration of the mysteries they had witnessed. This contemplative way is as legitimate as the way of martyrdom. The exact circumstances of Mary Magdalene's death remain shrouded in mystery, but the traditions preserved in Provence offer accounts that, although impossible to completely verify, merit careful consideration as possible preservations of historical memories. According to the most widespread tradition, Mary Magdalene would have lived approximately 30 years in the grotto of Saint-Baume in profound contemplation. The tradition relates that, feeling the proximity of her death, she left the grotto and descended to the plain, heading to a small chapel or oratory where Maximin, her spiritual companion, celebrated the liturgy. Some versions of the tradition describe that she received final communion from Maximin's hands before dying peacefully, surrounded by celestial light. Other versions claim that she herself would have asked to be taken to that place specifically to receive the last sacraments before her passing. This emphasis on final communion is significant, connecting her death with the Last Supper she would have witnessed decades before. The tradition does not present her death as martyrdom, but as a tranquil passage after a life of contemplation and prayer. This characterization contrasts strongly with the martyrdom narratives that surround other apostles: Peter crucified upside down, Paul beheaded, James killed by the sword. Why would Mary Magdalene have such a different death? Some historical analyses suggest that this difference may reflect historical realities. The great persecutions of Christians in the Roman Empire concentrated primarily in urban areas and on high-profile figures. Someone living in contemplative isolation in a remote area could in fact have avoided the attention of Roman authorities and lived to old age. Other scholars propose that the narrative of peaceful death may have been a deliberate choice of the local tradition to emphasize a different aspect of discipleship, not witness through the blood of martyrdom, but witness through contemplative faithfulness over decades. Both forms of witness have profound spiritual value. The date traditionally attributed to her death is July 22nd, although the exact year is the subject of speculation. If she was approximately 30 years old during Jesus' ministry, a common assumption, but not verifiable, and lived another 30 years in Provence, she would have died around the year 60-70 AD, approximately at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. This temporal synchronization is interesting. The destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD marked the definitive end of the original Jewish Christian community in the Holy Land. If Mary Magdalene died close to that time, she would have been one of the last living witnesses of the gospel events. Her death would have marked the closing of an era, the era of direct eyewitnesses to Jesus. The tradition preserves that her body was initially buried in a simple crypt at Saint-Maximin. The location would have been known and venerated by local Christians, but not widely publicized, possibly to protect the mortal remains during periods of persecution. This practice of discreet burial was common among early Christian communities. An interesting detail in the traditions is that Mary Magdalene would have maintained silence about many of the mysteries she witnessed. Unlike other apostles who traveled widely preaching and evangelizing, she would have chosen a path of interiorization, of silent preservation of the deepest mysteries of her experience with Christ. This choice of contemplative silence over public proclamation may partially explain why her story was less preserved in official records. Those who traveled and preached publicly, like Paul, Peter, and others, naturally left more historical records. Someone who chose the path of silent contemplation would leave fewer documentary traces. However, there is another dimension to consider. Some ancient manuscripts suggest that Mary Magdalene possessed esoteric teachings, knowledge transmitted to her directly by Jesus. The Gospel of Mary, for example, describes teachings about the nature of spiritual vision and the ascent of the soul that she shared with other disciples. If she really possessed special teachings, why were they not more widely preserved? One possibility is that certain teachings were considered suitable only for those at advanced stages of spiritual development. The Christian tradition has always recognized the existence of deeper teachings that should not be indiscriminately divulged. Paul himself mentions in 1 Corinthians 3:2 that he gave milk to the Corinthians instead of solid food because they were not ready. If Mary Magdalene was the guardian of deeper teachings, her death would have represented not just the loss of an eyewitness, but potentially the loss of knowledge that she could not completely transmit before dying. This possibility adds a layer of tragedy to her death, not just a life that ended, but knowledge that may have died with her. The tradition preserves that in her last moments, Mary Magdalene would have expressed gratitude for her journey and peace about her destiny. She would have affirmed that she completed the work entrusted to her and was ready to reunite with her master. This narrative of completeness and fulfillment contrasts with the sense of loss that many feel about what was not preserved of her teachings. There is a profound paradox here. On one hand, the tradition presents her death as peaceful and complete. On the other hand, there is a persistent feeling through the centuries that something important was lost, that the story was not completely told, that valuable teachings were not adequately preserved. This paradox may reflect a deeper truth, that not everything needs to be preserved in written words. Some spiritual truths are transmitted not through texts, but through living presence, through embodied example, through silent witness. Mary Magdalene may have deliberately chosen not to record everything, trusting that the essential would be transmitted by other means. Mary Magdalene's death, then, is not just the end of a biological life, but a spiritual mystery in itself. It invites us to reflect on what is truly important to preserve, on the difference between textual knowledge and lived wisdom, on the value of contemplative silence in a religion that would become increasingly defined by written texts and formulated doctrines. What we know for certain is that one of the most important figures of early Christianity died far from where she began her journey, in foreign lands in relative isolation. Her death was not widely recorded. Her final teachings were not extensively preserved, and her tomb became an object of localized veneration instead of universal pilgrimage. This is the tragedy of Mary Magdalene's end. Not that she died violently or prematurely, but that her death marked the silencing of a voice that the early church never managed to hear completely. The loss of teachings that might have transformed the way Christianity developed, and the beginning of centuries in which her true importance would be obscured and distorted. The question we must directly face is, why was the death of a figure as important as Mary Magdalene not more widely recorded and preserved in the official documents of the early church? Why do we have detailed traditions about the martyrdoms of Peter, Paul, James, and others, but only fragments and local traditions about Mary Magdalene? To understand this, we need to examine the broader context of the structuring of the early church and the tensions that existed about leadership, authority, and the role of women in the Christian community. In the first years after the resurrection, the Christian community was remarkably inclusive compared to the Jewish and Greco-Roman cultural norms of the time. Paul's letters mention women in leadership positions. Phoebe, described as a deaconess, Romans 16:1. Priscilla, who taught Apollos, Acts 18:26. Junia, called outstanding among the apostles, Romans 16:7, among others. However, as the church institutionalized throughout the 2nd and 3rd centuries, a more rigid hierarchical structure began to form. This structuring largely followed the patriarchal patterns of the Greco-Roman societies in which Christianity was expanding. Academic studies of this period show a progressive masculinization of ecclesiastical leadership. Documents such as the pastoral epistles, 1 and 2 Timothy, Titus, which many scholars believe are of later authorship attributed to Paul, reflect this tendency. 1 Timothy 2:11-12 declares, "A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet." This position contrasts strongly with the evident practice in Paul's authentic letters and in the Gospels. In this context of institutional consolidation, female leadership figures could be seen as problematic, not because there was anything intrinsically wrong with female leadership, but because it did not fit the hierarchical and cultural patterns that the church was adopting as it became a more formalized institution. Mary Magdalene represented a particular challenge. She was not just a woman leader, but specifically the first witness of the resurrection. This fundamental role could not be erased from the Gospels. The tradition was too strong, but it could be minimized, contextualized, or balanced by other narratives that emphasized masculine leadership. The fusion of her identity with the anonymous sinner of Luke 7, promoted by Pope Gregory the Great in 591 AD, can be seen in this context. Transforming Mary Magdalene from disciple and principal witness to repentant sinner maintained her place in the Christian narrative, but in a way that did not challenge the developing patriarchal structures. A sinner saved by grace did not threaten masculine leadership in the same way that a recognized apostle would threaten. Some Gnostic manuscripts, such as the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Philip, preserve memories of explicit tensions between Mary Magdalene and Peter over issues of authority and teaching. Although these texts are late and contain theological elements specific to Gnosticism, they may reflect real memories of conflicts in the early community about the role of women in leadership. The silence about Mary Magdalene's death, then, was not necessarily an active conspiracy of concealment, but part of a broader pattern of minimization of female figures in the official history of the Church. If her actions during Jesus' life could not be erased, because they were firmly established in the Gospels, her later destiny could simply not be widely publicized or recorded. There are also practical considerations. Mary Magdalene, if she really lived in contemplative isolation in Provence, was far from the main centers of early Christianity: Jerusalem, Antioch, Rome, Alexandria. Her death, occurring in a remote region, would naturally receive less attention than the deaths of figures who were active in the main urban centers of Christianity. Furthermore, if she chose a contemplative and silent path instead of active public evangelization, there would naturally be fewer people aware of her presence and, consequently, of her death. The silence she may have chosen in life became, ironically, a silence about her death. Another important dimension is the nature of the teachings that Mary Magdalene may have possessed. If she was the guardian of esoteric or mystical teachings, these teachings may have been viewed with suspicion by church leaders who were moving toward more rigid and orthodox doctrinal formulations. The death of a guardian of non-orthodox teachings might not be something that ecclesiastical authorities wanted to widely commemorate or publicize, The Christological debates of the first centuries about the nature of Christ, the relationship between humanity and divinity, the understanding of salvation, were intense and sometimes violent. Different Christian groups had very different understandings of these fundamental questions. If Mary Magdalene was associated with currents of thought that were eventually declared heretical, this would explain why her memory was treated with caution. However, it is crucial not to fall into simplistic conspiracy theories. There is no evidence of a secret meeting where church leaders deliberately decided to erase the memory of Mary Magdalene. What there was a complex historical process through which certain narratives were privileged, certain figures were emphasized, and others were gradually marginalized. This process was not unique to Mary Magdalene. Many aspects of early Christianity were simplified, standardized, or minimized as the Church became a more unified institution. The theological diversity and practices of the first centuries were progressively reduced in favor of greater doctrinal uniformity. The tragedy is not that there was deliberate ill intent, but that in the process of institutionalization, important voices were silenced, valuable narratives were lost, and the richness of early Christian experience was impoverished. Mary Magdalene became a symbol of this loss, not because of some dramatic conspiracy, but due to the ordinary dynamics of power, gender, and institutional formation. The result was that one of the most important figures of early Christianity had her legacy distorted, her death poorly recorded, and her true historical importance obscured for centuries. Only in the last 100 years, with the development of modern biblical criticism and the discovery of ancient manuscripts, have we begun to recover a more complete understanding of who she really was. To fully comprehend what may have been lost with Mary Magdalene's death and the subsequent silencing of her memory, we need to examine the ancient texts that preserve traditions about her teachings, particularly those that were not included in the official biblical canon. In 1945, Egyptian farmers discovered a ceramic jar near the city of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt. Inside this jar were 52 ancient texts written in Coptic, dating from the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, but probably translated from even older Greek originals. This discovery revolutionized our understanding of early Christianity, revealing the theological diversity that existed in the first centuries. Among these texts was the Gospel of Mary, a document that preserves traditions about Mary Magdalene that differ significantly from the official narrative. Although this text contains elements of 2nd century Gnostic theology, it may preserve older memories about Mary Magdalene's role in the early Christian community. In the Gospel of Mary, after Jesus' ascension, the disciples are disturbed and afraid. Mary Magdalene rises to console them and share teachings that Jesus transmitted to her in private. She describes a vision about the nature of the soul and its ascent through different spheres of existence, overcoming cosmic powers through spiritual knowledge. When she finishes, Andrew expresses doubt. "Say what you think about what she said. I, at least, do not believe that the Savior said this, for certainly these teachings are strange ideas." Peter then adds, "Did he really speak with a woman in secret without our knowledge? Should we change our customs and all listen to this woman? Did he prefer her to us?" Levi, probably Matthew, responds defending Mary. "Peter, you have always been impetuous. Now I see you contending against the woman as an adversary. If the Savior made her worthy, who are you to reject her? Surely the Savior knows her very well. That is why he loved her more than us." This dialogue, although in a non-canonical and late text, may preserve memories of real tensions in the early community. The characterization of Peter as resisting Mary's teaching authority finds parallels in other ancient texts, suggesting that this was a persistent memory in certain currents of early Christianity. The Gospel of Philip, another Nag Hammadi text, contains a frequently cited but controversial passage. In a fragmented section of the manuscript it reads, "The companion of the Savior is Mary Magdalene. Christ loved her more than all the disciples and used to kiss her often on the mouth." The rest of the disciples were offended by this and expressed disapproval. They said to him, "Why do you love her more than all of us?" It is crucial to note that the parts in brackets are reconstructions, as the manuscript is damaged at those points. Furthermore, in the context of Christian Gnosticism, the kiss frequently had sacramental or spiritual meaning, not necessarily romantic or sexual. The text may be describing Mary as a recipient of special spiritual knowledge, not necessarily a romantic relationship. What these texts preserve, at minimum, is a memory that Mary Magdalene occupied a special position of proximity with Jesus, and that this position generated tensions with other disciples. This memory is consistent with what we see even in the canonical Gospels. Mary is always close, always present at crucial moments, always mentioned first among the women. Another relevant text is the Pistis Sophia, a 3rd century Gnostic text that presents Mary Magdalene asking more questions and receiving more teachings than any other disciple. At one point, Jesus says, "Mary, you blessed one, whom I will complete in all the mysteries of the heights. Speak openly, you whose heart is turned toward the kingdom of heaven more than all your brothers." These texts, although non-canonical and containing theology that the Orthodox Church eventually rejected, preserve a persistent tradition. Mary Magdalene was a bearer of special teachings, of esoteric knowledge, of wisdom that Jesus transmitted to her directly. This tradition is sufficiently ancient and widespread to suggest some historical basis. What does this mean for understanding Mary Magdalene's lost legacy? It suggests that she may have been the guardian of dimensions of Christian spirituality that were subsequently marginalized, teachings about direct mystical experience, about the inner journey of the soul, about spiritual knowledge that transcends doctrinal formulations. When Mary Magdalene died in her grotto in Provence, if these traditions have any historical basis, valuable teachings may have died with her. Not because she deliberately kept them secret, but because the historical context was not conducive to their preservation. The Church was moving toward more rigid hierarchical structures, toward more fixed doctrinal formulations, toward an emphasis on institutional authority over personal mystical experience. The teachings associated with Mary Magdalene emphasized precisely the opposite: direct experience of the divine, spiritual authority based on inner illumination, knowledge that comes from personal encounter with the sacred. These teachings, although a legitimate part of the early Christian heritage, became progressively suspect and marginalized. Mary Magdalene's forbidden legacy, then, is not some secret factual knowledge about Jesus, but an entire dimension of Christian spirituality that was suppressed, the mystical, contemplative, experiential, feminine dimension. The loss of this legacy impoverished Christianity, removing aspects that could have balanced the institutional tendency toward hierarchical structures and doctrinal formulations. It is significant that Christian mystics throughout the centuries frequently felt special affinity with Mary Magdalene. Saint Teresa of Avila, Saint John of the Cross, and other great mystics venerated Mary Magdalene as a model of contemplative love and direct experience of the divine. They intuitively recognized in her a guardian of dimensions of Christian spirituality that complemented the more institutional and doctrinal forms of religion. Now, a question for you, wherever you are watching this video: from which country are you joining us on this journey of discovery? Write in the comments your location. I want to see how far this search for the complete truth has reached. This is not just ancient history. It is a global awakening about narratives that were silenced. Leave your mark here. Show that you are part of this movement to recover forgotten voices. The tension between different understandings of Mary Magdalene, as penitent saint versus apostle and fundamental witness, reveals much about how the Church historically dealt with female figures of spiritual authority. This tension persists to this day and reflects broader questions about gender, power, and holiness in Christianity. In the Western tradition, for most of the last 1500 years, Mary Magdalene was primarily venerated as the repentant sinner. Her liturgical feast, celebrated on July 22nd, emphasized her conversion and penitence. Artistic representations frequently showed her in tears, with loose hair, in postures of dramatic repentance. This emphasis on penitence, although theologically rich in terms of demonstrating the power of divine grace, effectively obscured her real historical role. She became a symbol of conversion and mercy, but not of apostolic leadership or teaching authority. Her importance was in being saved, not in being sent. The Eastern tradition, by contrast, never completely adopted the identification of Mary Magdalene with the anonymous sinner. The Orthodox Church has always recognized her as is apostolos, equal to the apostles. Her feast in the Eastern tradition emphasizes not her penitence but her role as first witness of the resurrection and announcer of the good news. This difference between Eastern and Western traditions is significant. It demonstrates that there was no universal consensus on how to understand Mary Magdalene. Different branches of Christianity preserved different memories, emphasized different aspects of her identity. In the 20th century, advances in biblical criticism began to question the traditional Western identification. Scholars demonstrated that the Gospels clearly distinguish different women and that there is no textual basis for merging Mary Magdalene with the sinner of Luke 7. This academic revision gradually influenced ecclesial practice. In 1969, as part of the liturgical reforms after the Second Vatican Council, the Roman Catholic Church officially separated the figure of Mary Magdalene from the anonymous sinner in the liturgy. Her feast was reformulated to emphasize her role as witness of the resurrection. This was a belated but significant recognition of a historical error of interpretation. More recently, in 2016, Pope Francis elevated the liturgical memory of Mary Magdalene from memorial to feast, placing her at the same level of celebration as the apostles. The decree of the Congregation for Divine Worship explicitly called her Apostle to the Apostles, officially recognizing her fundamental role. These liturgical changes are important because they reflect a growing institutional recognition that the Church historically did not do justice to Mary Magdalene. They represent an attempt to correct centuries of misinterpretation and minimization. However, the question remains, why did it take almost 2,000 years for this official recognition? The answer lies in the dynamics of gender and power that shaped the institutional development of the Church. For most of Christian history, women were excluded from positions of teaching authority and sacramental leadership. This exclusion was theologically justified in various ways, but fundamentally reflected patriarchal cultural norms. In this context, recognizing Mary Magdalene as an apostle, as someone sent by Christ with teaching authority, could be seen as dangerous. If Mary Magdalene was an apostle, if she received special teachings, if she had spiritual authority recognized by Christ himself, what implications would this have for the exclusion of women from ecclesial leadership? This question was and remains uncomfortable for those who defend the exclusion of women from ordained ministry. The historical solution was to maintain Mary Magdalene as a venerable saint, but not as a model of apostolic leadership. She could be a saint, contemplative, mystic, penitent, roles considered appropriate for women, but fully recognizing her as an apostle with teaching authority equivalent to the 12 would challenge the theological basis for female exclusion from leadership roles. This tension has not been resolved. Even with the recent liturgical recognition of Mary Magdalene as apostle to the apostles, churches that exclude women from ordination continue this practice. There is a logical inconsistency here. If Mary Magdalene had apostolic authority given directly by Christ, why can contemporary women not exercise similar authority? Different Christian traditions respond to this question in different ways. Some churches now ordain women to all levels of ministry, seeing Mary Magdalene as biblical precedent for female leadership. Others maintain exclusion of women while simultaneously trying to honor Mary Magdalene, creating an unresolved theological tension. What we can affirm with historical certainty is that Mary Magdalene occupied a position of extraordinary importance in early Christianity. She was a fundamental witness of the resurrection, recognized in all 4 canonical Gospels. She was explicitly sent by Christ with a message to the other disciples. In the technical sense of the term, she was an apostle. If we recognize this fully, then we must also recognize that the historical minimization of her role and the distortion of her identity represent an injustice not only to her personally, but to historical truth and to the integrity of the Christian narrative. Mary Magdalene challenges us to examine how narratives are constructed, how power functions, and how marginalized voices can be simultaneously venerated and silenced. She is a saint, certainly, but reducing her identity only to personal holiness while ignoring her apostolic authority is to perpetuate the same pattern of minimization that has obscured her story for centuries. The question of Mary Magdalene's relics adds another layer of complexity and mystery to her story. In 1279, during excavations ordered by Prince Charles of Salerno in the crypt of the church at Saint-Maximin-la-Sainte-Baume, mortal remains identified as belonging to Mary Magdalene were discovered. The Basilica of Saint-Maximin-la-Sainte-Baume, built between the 13th and 15th centuries, became one of the main pilgrimage sites of medieval Europe. The discovery of the relics in 1279 was an event of enormous religious and political significance. Pilgrimages to St. Maximin rivaled those to Santiago de Compostela and Canterbury in popularity. The official account of the discovery describes that mortal remains were found in a marble sarcophagus, along with an inscription identifying them as Mary Magdalene's. Also found was a container believed to hold earth mixed with Christ's blood, which Mary Magdalene would have brought from Judea. From a modern historical point of view, we must approach these relics with healthy skepticism. The Middle Ages saw a proliferation of relics, many of dubious authenticity. Relic discoveries were frequently motivated by political and economic interests. Pilgrimages brought considerable prestige and income to local regions. Furthermore, several localities in medieval Europe claimed to possess relics of Mary Magdalene. Vézelay in Burgundy had been an important pilgrimage center since the 11th century, also claiming to possess Mary Magdalene's relics. The discovery at Saint-Maximin in 1279 conveniently established Provence as the true location of the relics, displacing Vézelay from its position of prominence. However, we must be cautious about completely dismissing the significance of these relics. Regardless of their biological authenticity, they represent a continuity of veneration and memory that dates back centuries. The cult of Mary Magdalene at Saint-Maximin did not begin in 1279. The discovery of the relics occurred at a location already considered sacred by local tradition for a long time. Archaeological studies of the site reveal that there was a religious structure at the location since at least the 5th century. This suggests that the veneration of Mary Magdalene in the area predates the Middle Ages by a long time. The tradition of her presence in Provence is ancient and well established, even if the specific authenticity of the relics discovered in 1279 cannot be verified. The basilica itself is an impressive testament to Mary Magdalene's importance in medieval devotion. It is the third largest Gothic church in southern France, surpassed only by the cathedrals of Toulouse and Narbonne. Its construction was sponsored by the Counts of Provence and the Popes of Avignon, demonstrating the high level of institutional support for the cult of Mary Magdalene in that region. The crypt of the basilica, where the relics are kept, is a space of profound solemnity. Visitors throughout the centuries describe an atmosphere of palpable spiritual presence. Regardless of questions of physical authenticity, the place functions as sacred space where people connect with the deeper dimensions of their faith. The relics include a skull kept in a gold reliquary, in addition to other preserved bones. Modern scientific analyses of these relics are complicated by centuries of veneration and handling, making it difficult to determine their age or origin with precision. Furthermore, there are ethical questions about submitting objects of religious veneration to invasive tests. What is most significant from a historical point of view is not necessarily whether these are literally Mary Magdalene's bones, but what the continuous veneration of these relics reveals about her importance in popular devotion. Millions of pilgrims throughout the centuries have visited Saint-Maximin seeking connection with Mary Magdalene. For these pilgrims, the relics served as a tangible point of contact with the sacred. They represented a physical connection with someone who had touched Jesus, who had witnessed the resurrection, who had lived the mysteries they longed to understand. The authenticity of the relics was less important than the authenticity of the spiritual experience they facilitated. The tradition of the relics also preserves another important aspect: the continuity of memory. Even when the official texts of the Church did not emphasize Mary Magdalene, even when her identity was distorted as a sinner, popular veneration preserved the memory of her true importance. During the French Revolution, the basilica was converted into a warehouse, and the relics were dispersed. Some of the bones were saved by local citizens and hidden until they could be returned after the end of the Terror. This act of preservation during dangerous times demonstrates the profound attachment that people had to these relics, regardless of questions of scientific authenticity. After the Revolution, the relics were restored to the basilica, which was reconsecrated. Pilgrimages continued through the 19th and 20th centuries, although in reduced numbers compared to the medieval peak. In recent years, there has been a revival of interest, with modern pilgrims seeking connection with the deeper dimensions of Christian faith that Mary Magdalene represents. The grotto of Saint-Baume, located in the mountains above Saint-Maximin, remains another important pilgrimage site. Hundreds of thousands visit annually, making the steep ascent to the grotto where Mary Magdalene would have spent her last years in contemplation. The experience of being in the grotto, of feeling the silence and presence of the place, has a power that transcends questions of historical verification. What the relics and pilgrimage sites reveal is that Mary Magdalene was never completely forgotten, despite the official silence about aspects of her story. Popular devotion preserved her memory when institutional structures did not. The pilgrims who walked to Saint-Baume throughout the centuries, the faithful who venerated the relics at Saint-Maximin, they kept the flame of her memory alive. This is a different form of historical preservation, not through official texts or ecclesiastical documents, but through devotional practices, oral traditions, and the faithfulness of local communities that refuse to forget. It is a story preserved in the feet of pilgrims, in prayers murmured before relics, in the persistence of traditions through centuries of change. Mary Magdalene's relics, true or not in a biological sense, are true in a deeper sense. They are witnesses to her continuing importance in the spiritual life of millions, to the refusal of common people to accept official silence, to the persistence of popular memory against all odds. When we stand before these relics or visit these sacred places, we are participating in a current of memory that goes back almost 2,000 years. We are connecting not just with a historical figure, but with generations of seekers who found in Mary Magdalene a model of faith, of dedication, of direct spiritual experience. The tragedy is not that the relics may or may not be authentic. The tragedy is that we need relics to remember someone who should be central to our historical narrative. The tragedy is that official memory was so incomplete that popular memory had to preserve what was institutionally neglected. What does all this investigation about Mary Magdalene, her life, death, legacy and memory, mean for us today? Why should it matter, 2,000 years later, that a historical figure was misunderstood or that her story was incomplete in official records? The answer is that Mary Magdalene's story is not just about the past. It is about how narratives are constructed, how voices are silenced, and how truths can be recovered. It is about what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget. It is about who has the authority to tell stories and whose experiences are validated. The recovery of Mary Magdalene's true story, which began seriously only in the 20th century, with advances in biblical criticism and the discovery of ancient manuscripts, is part of a broader movement to recover marginalized voices in history. Not just women's voices, but all those whose experiences were considered inconvenient or problematic by official narratives. When we recognize that Mary Magdalene was the first witness of the resurrection, that she occupied a position of leadership in the early Christian community, that she was possibly the guardian of important esoteric teachings, when we recognize all this, we are forced to re-examine fundamental assumptions about gender, authority, and spirituality in Christianity. This re-examination is not an attack on Christian faith. On the contrary, it is a deepening of that faith, a recovery of dimensions that were lost. Christianity is not impoverished by recognizing Mary Magdalene's full role, it is enriched. Faith is not threatened by historical truth, it is strengthened by it. For Christian women specifically, the recovery of Mary Magdalene's story has profound significance. For centuries, the primary example of Mary Magdalene presented by the Church was that of repentant sinner, a problematic model that reinforced negative stereotypes about women. The recovery of her real identity as disciple, leader, and apostle offers a very different and more empowering model. But Mary Magdalene's relevance extends beyond gender issues. She represents the mystical and contemplative dimension of Christian spirituality that has frequently been marginalized in favor of institutional structures and doctrinal formulations. Her direct experience of the divine, her path of inner knowledge, her years of silent contemplation, all this points to a form of faith that complements and balances the more external forms of religion. In an era where many people seek authentic spirituality beyond institutional religious forms, Mary Magdalene offers a model within the Christian tradition itself. She demonstrates that it is possible to have deep faith that does not depend on external hierarchies or institutional mediations, but that emerges from direct encounter with the sacred. Her story also teaches us about the nature of historical truth. The official truth is not always the complete truth. Narratives preserved in the margins of history, traditions maintained by local communities, memories transmitted through popular devotional practices, all these can contain important truths that were excluded from official records. This does not mean we should uncritically accept every alternative tradition or every conspiracy theory. It means we should approach history with humility, recognizing that our knowledge is always incomplete and that new discoveries can force us to revise established understandings. The trajectory of understanding Mary Magdalene in the last 100 years demonstrates exactly this. Archaeological discoveries like the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, developments in critical historical methodology, and careful re-examination of canonical texts, all this has led to a fundamental re-evaluation of who she was and what role she occupied. This process of re-evaluation continues. Each generation discovers new dimensions of the story, new questions to ask, new connections to make. History is not fixed. It is alive, dynamic, always revealing itself in new ways as we bring new perspectives and new analytical tools. For those of you who feel uncomfortable with this re-evaluation, who feel that questioning established narratives is questioning faith itself, allow me to offer a different perspective. True faith is not afraid of truth. If our faith depends on inaccurate or incomplete historical narratives, then it is a fragile faith. If our faith can grow and deepen through more complete understanding of historical truth, then it is a robust and living faith. The Catholic Church in 2016 elevated Mary Magdalene's feast to the level of apostolic feast. This was not a betrayal of tradition. It was a correction of tradition, a recognition that the Church had been mistaken for centuries in its understanding of Mary Magdalene. This capacity for self-correction, for recognizing past errors and embracing more complete truth, is a sign of institutional vitality, not weakness. The awakening of truth about Mary Magdalene is part of a broader awakening happening in our time. It is an awakening to the complexity of history, to the plurality of voices that must be heard, to the limitations of official narratives. It is an awakening that recognizes that truth is frequently richer, more complex and more interesting than the simplified versions that were transmitted to us. This awakening is not without discomfort. Questioning established narratives, recognizing that we were taught incomplete versions of history, confronting the ways power and prejudice shaped what we know, all this can be disturbing, but it is also liberating. When we recover Mary Magdalene's complete story, we recover something of ourselves. We recover the possibility of faith that does not depend on external authorities, but emerges from inner experience. We recover models of spiritual leadership that include instead of exclude. We recover mystical and contemplative dimensions of spirituality that balance the more rational and institutional forms of religion. Mary Magdalene's tragic death was not her physical martyrdom, but the martyrdom of her memory, the distortion of her identity, the silencing of her voice, the minimization of her legacy. But memories, once recovered, have extraordinary power. They connect us through time, bind us to fundamental human experiences, show us possibilities we thought lost. Mary Magdalene's true legacy is not in relics or pilgrimage sites, however sacred they may be. It is in the inspiration she offers to all of us who seek truth, who refuse to accept incomplete narratives, who insist on hearing voices that were silenced. It is in the example of faithfulness she demonstrated, remaining when others fled, witnessing when others doubted, keeping alive the flame of faith through decades of exile and isolation. Her story teaches us that truth, however long it is suppressed, eventually emerges. It may take centuries, it may require the persistence of countless seekers, but truth has an inexorable quality. It cannot be permanently buried. We have reached the end of this journey through the life, death, and legacy of Mary Magdalene. What we discovered was not a sensationalist conspiracy, but something deeper and more significant. A story of how narratives are constructed, how voices are silenced, and how truths can be recovered even after centuries of forgetfulness. Mary Magdalene was not a repentant prostitute, although this is the image that dominated for centuries. She was a disciple, leader, first witness of the resurrection, possibly guardian of important esoteric teachings. Her death, far from Jerusalem, in exile in Provence, marked not just the end of a life, but potentially the loss of valuable knowledge she carried. The silence about her final destiny was not accidental. It was part of a broader pattern of minimization of female figures as the Church institutionalized and adopted patriarchal structures of the societies where it expanded. This silencing had consequences. It impoverished our understanding of early Christianity, removed important mystical and contemplative dimensions, and deprived generations of a powerful model of female spiritual leadership. But the story does not end in silence. Local traditions preserved memories that official texts did not record. Popular devotion kept her importance alive when institutional structures did not. Pilgrims throughout centuries walked to grottos and basilicas, refusing to forget. And in our own era, through archaeological discoveries, modern biblical criticism, and careful re-examination of ancient sources, we are recovering the more complete story. This recovery matters. It matters because truth always matters. It matters because silenced voices deserve to be heard. It matters because faith is strengthened, not threatened, by more complete historical understanding. It matters because each of us, in our own spiritual journey, deserves to have access to all the richness of the Christian tradition, including those dimensions that were marginalized or suppressed. The tragedy of Mary Magdalene's end is not in how she died, but in how her memory was treated. But there is also triumph in this story. The triumph of truth that cannot be permanently buried, of memory that resists forgetting, of the persistence of seekers who refuse to accept incomplete narratives. If this journey resonated with you, if you feel that recovering silent stories is important work, then join this community of seekers. Subscribe to this channel, because we will continue exploring truths that were marginalized, narratives that deserve to be retold, dimensions of spiritual history that enrich our understanding. I do not promise easy answers or empty sensationalism. I promise honest investigation, respect for all perspectives of faith, and commitment to verifiable truth. I promise that we will continue asking the difficult questions, examining the gaps in official narratives, and recovering voices that deserve to be heard. The next video that will appear on your screen continues this journey of discovery. Click on it, because there is much more to explore, much more to understand, much more truth waiting to be recovered. Each video is a piece of the larger puzzle, the complete story of Christian faith in all its complexity, richness, and diversity. Mary Magdalene taught us that faithfulness is not about public recognition, but about remaining firm in inner conviction. That witness is not always dramatic, but frequently silent and contemplative. That truth, even when suppressed, eventually finds its way to the light. That silenced voices continue echoing through the centuries, waiting for someone to have the courage to listen. Her story is our story, the story of all who seek truth beyond official narratives, who insist on hearing marginalized voices, who believe that faith is large enough to embrace all the complexity of historical truth. Thank you for watching until the end. Until the next video.